I hadn't even gotten out of my car when I saw the man in the gray jacket standing at the edge of my driveway. Before he even said a word, the way he stood there, just waiting, made my stomach drop. Mom, I need to confirm your identity. I'd just gotten back from the florist. I'd gone to pick up the flowers I'd forgotten at the cemetery 2 days ago. My husband's body was barely cold, and this man was standing on my driveway like a messenger sent by some cruel cosmic joke to remind me that grief never gives you a moment to breathe. Miss Mrs. Odessa, 2 doors down, was standing by her mailbox, pretending to read letters she'd already checked twice. I didn't have to look over to know she was watching. That's the classic American suburban neighborhood for you. Everyone knows your business before you do. I need to confirm your identity, Mom, he said again. His voice was flatter this time, the way it must sound when you've stood in the same spot and said the same thing to thousands of women. Scripted. Empty. My name is Priscilla Winfield. Until that Tuesday morning, I thought the worst thing that could possibly happen to me had already happened. I'd buried the man I'd been with for 31 years just 4 days earlier. I'd convinced myself that morning was the only mountain I'd have to climb alone for the rest of my life. I didn't know that, right at that moment, someone else was quietly piling up another, far more treacherous peak behind my back. Yes, I told him. That's me. He handed me a thin stack of papers in a blue legal folder and muttered something about having a nice day. He said it with the same casual tone he'd used to hand over a receipt from Walmart, then turned and walked back to his Ford. Mrs. Odessa was still at her mailbox. I gave her a small nod. The kind you give when you want no one to notice your hands are shaking. Then I walked into my house, as if my legs knew where to go, even when my brain had shut down. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. I have a hunch some of you already know the kind of hollow, deathly quiet I walked into that day. Wherever you're sitting right now, I need you to stay with me as I explain what happened next. I set my purse on the granite kitchen counter and placed the blue folder next to it. I stared at those papers for a long time before I could force myself to touch them. A part of me, the part that had spent years reading legal documents for a living, already knew exactly what kind of trouble this was. But I opened it anyway. The first page had a case number and the name of a court I knew all too well. The Montgomery County Courthouse in Pennsylvania. I'd walked those halls countless times to earn a living, even though my family never really understood what that living actually entailed. My name was typed cleanly under the word defendant, Priscilla Winfield. And right above it, in bold, undeniable print, was a name that shattered my heart in a single second. Plaintiff, Jared Winfield. My son. I read that name 3 times before I could even begin to process it. Even then, it made no sense. Logic dictates that your son calls you, asks you questions, gives you one chance, just one, to explain whatever he thinks you've done. But he didn't. He acted like a complete stranger. He sent a process server to my driveway to hand me a lawsuit. I flipped to the next page. My hands were surprisingly steady because I needed to know exactly what my own flesh and blood was accusing me of. At the top of the next section, one lonely word stared back at me. Exploitation. I didn't cry when I saw it. I hope you understand that, because I was surprised myself. I folded the papers back along the creases, placed them on the counter as if they belonged to someone else, and did the only thing a woman who'd just buried her husband could do. I walked into Sherman's closet. At 9 in the morning, when you're hit with a sudden lawsuit, there is absolutely nothing you can do in this world. But when you're standing in front of a man's shirts still hanging where he left them, you can always do something. Sherman always kept his side of the closet organized, just as loud and present as he was when he spoke. His colorful ties were crowded together like they were arguing. I started with his coats, folding each one and putting it into a bag to donate to Goodwill. For a while it felt good, purposeful, like my restless grief had finally found something to do with my hands. Then, my fingers brushed against something hard behind his winter jackets. A metal box. Gray, small enough to tuck under an arm, with a built-in lock on the front, as if it were guarding itself against being found. I didn't recognize the box. 31 years of marriage, and I could tell you the brand of every pair of shoes the man owned. But I swear I'd never seen this box before. Before I could pull it out, the landline in the kitchen rang. I almost let it ring. My grief had taught me which sounds were worth my attention and which ones could wait. But deep down, an old intuition I hadn't used in years told me to listen. I didn't pick up. I let it go to voicemail while I stood there holding the box. A minute later, I was standing at the door of the walk-in closet. A hanger pressed against my shoulder, hitting the play button, Mrs. Winfield, this is the law firm of Desmond Aldridge. We are representing your son in the lawsuit filed this week. We'd like to schedule a time to discuss the details of the claims. Please return our call at your earliest convenience. Direct. Brief. That professionally trained tone that sounds polite but hides a cold, underlying hostility. So, this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some overworked paralegal sending the wrong paperwork. My son had hired someone. My son sat in a conference room with someone and decided this was a fight worth starting. I set the phone on the vanity and looked at the box again. Looking at it was easier than thinking about what that voicemail meant. The lock was easier to open than I expected. I found the little key taped to the bottom of the box. That was just like Sherman. He always hid things he didn't want found right away, but didn't want to lose forever. I slowly opened the lid, half expecting old letters, maybe receipts, or nothing at all. But resting right on top was a photo I hadn't seen in over 20 years. Tucked under it was a folded note in Sherman's handwriting. To never be forgotten, even if she never wants to talk about it. The person in the photo was me. Younger, sharper eyes. Standing outside the same courthouse. I used to know better than my own street. I was wearing a professional blazer I'd forgotten I ever owned, clutching a folder to my chest as if it contained something worth dying for. It was a version of me my son had never seen. He'd never asked, and he'd never wondered why his mother sometimes disappeared into rooms full of lawyers, only to come back and say nothing about what she'd been doing there. Sherman never asked either. After the first few years, he realized I wanted that door closed. He didn't push it open. He just quietly saved a piece of it, keeping it safe for a day I never thought would come. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the photo in one hand and the note in the other. My son's lawyer's voice was still echoing in my head. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't know which pain to feel first. I sat with that photo for a long time before I could bring myself to pick up the phone. A part of me still believed that one conversation could undo the damage that piece of paper had started. I called Jared directly, not the law firm, not a text he could just ignore. I wanted to hear my son's voice, because I was still foolish enough to believe this was all a misunderstanding. I just needed 5 minutes to explain. He picked up on the third ring. Priscilla, not Mom. Not even a simple hello. Just my name, cold and dry, like he was reading it off a tag. Jared, honey, I got the papers this morning. I need you to tell me what's going on. Because none of this makes any sense to me. There was silence on the other end. That silence told me he wasn't reacting. He was reciting. I think it's best if we let the lawyers handle the details of the case. The case? I repeated the word slowly, feeling how absurd it was to use that word when talking to my own son. Jared, this isn't a case. This is you and me. You had plenty of chances to be transparent with me, he said. My chest tightened. That wasn't his language. I raised that boy. I know exactly how Jared sounds when he's thinking for himself versus when he's repeating what he's been told. Transparent about what? I tried to keep my voice steady, though it cost me everything. Say it plainly. Whatever you think I've done, tell me clearly. Son to mother, not lawyer to lawyer. Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing. And beneath that, I heard something else. Another voice in the room. Too low to make out the words, but I knew he wasn't alone. You know Dad's health was failing, he finally said. You controlled everything around him, every account, every decision. I never once got a straight conversation about what was actually mine. Yours? I repeated. You heard me. I closed my eyes. I thought about 30 years of packing his lunches, of missing important business calls so I could see his school plays, of folding my own life down to make his life broad, simple, and undisturbed. And now he called all of that stealing. Jared, I need you to listen to me for 1 minute. Don't let whoever is in that room tell you what to say next. There's no one else here, he replied, too quickly. In that moment, I knew I was talking to someone reading a script. Someone who had never sat across a dinner table from me. Someone who knew nothing about who I was before I became his mother. I'm asking you one last time, I said. Do you truly believe I stole your father's money? Or are you just repeating what someone else has made you feel? The silence on the line stretched out, long enough that I thought he might actually be honest. Long enough that a small, foolish part of me held its breath, hoping. Then, his voice shifted, just for a second. Underneath that rehearsed tone, I heard my real son. You were always too busy hiding things to really be my mother. Before I could say another word, he hung up. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in the bed Sherman, and I had shared for 30 years, staring at the ceiling, replaying my son's voice until it didn't sound like language anymore. It sounded like a jagged wound. The next morning, just past 10, my phone lit up on the nightstand. Jared's name was on the screen. My heart made a desperate, hopeful leap, a muscle memory reflex, making me believe he was calling to take it all back. I answered. Jared? No response. Just background noise. A television playing quietly somewhere. The clatter of a plate being set down. The muffled sound of fabric rubbing against the phone screen. It wasn't a call he'd made. It was a pocket dial, an accidental tap on the screen. I should have hung up immediately. Any decent person would have. But I didn't. I pressed the phone to my ear because I heard another voice underneath the noise. Something deep inside me, a part of me I hadn't let out in years, ordered me to keep listening. You can't talk to the lawyers like that, Jared. You have to be specific that she controlled everything. That's the core of the whole case. Chantel. I don't know, Jared said. His voice sounded weaker than when he spoke to me, less like he was reciting lines, and more like the boy I'd raised. It feels wrong to say she was hiding things when I'm not even sure she was. She was hiding things. Chantel's voice was flat and certain. It was the tone of someone who'd already made up her mind and just needed everyone else to catch up. Think about it. All these years, she controlled every account, never explained a word. That's not normal, Jared. That's what someone does when they have something to cover up. She raised me, Jared whispered. She was always there for me. Exactly! Chantel snapped back. Always there. Always watching. Always in control, but never telling you anything. Don't you find that strange? A woman that controlling, and you're only now discovering what she's been holding. I heard him take a long, hesitant breath. It was the sigh of a man being talked into doing something he hadn't fully committed to yet. Just tell Aldridge what I told you, Chantel said. Isolation, control, a vulnerable father. That's our story. That's the logic that wins this case. Okay, Jared said. Just those two words. No conviction, just compromise. In the background, I heard the faint, looping sound of hold music. The kind you hear when a call goes through, but no one answers. In that moment, I realized Jared's phone must have been forgotten on a counter or a couch cushion, and someone walking by had accidentally bumped the screen. I sat up in that empty bed, the phone still at my ear. In that darkness, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't shed another tear over this. I'd cried enough this week to last a lifetime. I hung up without a word. Let them believe the call just dropped, like any other accidental dial. I leaned back against my pillow. For the first time since the funeral, it wasn't grief that washed over me. It was something colder, older, and far more useful. Even after hiding it for so many years, I recognized it immediately. It was the feeling of starting to observe, rather than just witnessing. It's the difference between a woman who lets things happen to her and a woman who starts paying close attention to exactly how they happen. By morning, I had a name pulled up on my laptop screen. A regular estate attorney, someone a friend from church had used years ago for a property dispute. Nothing fancy, someone who knew nothing about the lawsuit being built against me. But it was a start. And knowing how to start was a skill I hadn't forgotten. Before my courage could fade, I picked up the phone and dialed his office. The Montgomery County Courthouse still smelled the same, old wood polish and industrial air conditioning. Walking through those double doors, after all these years, felt less like a memory and more like stepping back into a version of myself I'd folded away a long time ago. My lawyer, Mr. Garrison, the quiet, soft-spoken man who'd had helped my friend. sat at the defense table with me, shuffling through files that didn't really need shuffling. He was a good man, but I could already see that being a good man wasn't going to be enough. Jared sat across the aisle, his back straight, eyes fixed on the wall behind the judge's empty bench. He didn't look at me once. His gaze didn't even veer an inch in my direction. I realized that avoiding my face had become a deliberate choice, a state of mind he was working hard to maintain. Chantal sat next to him, hands folded, sitting perfectly, scanning the courtroom as if she already had the verdict in her pocket. The judge presiding over this scheduling conference wasn't Braddock, but another man who looked exhausted, flipping through his calendar like he had 4 more of these miserable cases to get through before lunch. When it was our turn, he asked the lawyers for a brief overview of the nature of the dispute so the court could set a trial schedule. Jared's lawyer, Desmond Aldridge, stood up, calm and confident. Your Honor, in short, this case concerns undue influence exerted by the spouse upon Sherman Winfield during a period of cognitive decline. Given the extensive financial records involved, we anticipate needing several months for discovery. I sat perfectly still. Years ago, I'd heard that kind of terminology used against other people from the other side of the courtroom, back when I was the one bringing the case, not the one defending against it. Hearing it aimed at me now felt like having a mirror held up that I didn't want to see. Mr. Garrison stood beside me. Your Honor, for the record, the defense categorically denies this characterization and is prepared to prove it through the discovery process. He sat back down. I was grateful for his effort. I just didn't believe it would be enough. The judge nodded, set a trial date, confirmed the discovery schedule, and moved on to the next case. It was as if ours were just a routine item on his morning to-do list. Afterward, we filed out into the hallway. Jared walked in front, his pace hurried, as if he couldn't wait to escape the building. Chantal lagged half a step behind him. As she passed me, close enough that no one else could hear, she slowed down. I hope all of this is worth it, she said with a sharp, polite smile. The kind you give to a stranger who held the door for you. I didn't acknowledge her. I didn't even turn my head. Some battles aren't worth the air it takes to speak. I saw right through what this was. A woman testing to see if she could still get a rise out of me. She couldn't. Not that day. I watched them walk away together, Jared's shoulders tense, Chantal's hand resting lightly on his back, as if she were steering him. I couldn't help but think how little my foolish son knew about the woman he'd chosen to stand by his side. Mr. Garrison touched my elbow, already talking about next steps, filing deadlines and evidence requests. I only heard half of it. My mind was already elsewhere, spiraling around the same unsettling fact. This case needed someone sharper than him. Just as we reached the main doors, a clerk stepped out from behind a desk and read aloud the list of assigned trial judges. Judge Trevor Braddock. I stopped in my tracks. The name stayed with me for the entire drive home. Braddock. I whispered it twice in the car. The way you test a key in an old lock you haven't used in years, not sure if it's still going to turn. Once home, I couldn't sit still. I skipped dinner. I headed straight for the small office at the back of the house. What Sherman used to joke was my thinking room. and pulled out the old laptop I hadn't opened since before he got sick. It took forever to boot up, the hard drive groaning as if it were complaining about being woken up. I typed that name into my own case log library. It was a private stash of notes I'd kept from my days as an investigator. I'd tracked every file I ever handled, even after it left my desk and became a case for some prosecutor to argue in court. Braddock T. A record popped up. A summary I'd written over 20 years ago, documenting an insurance fraud ring case that had taken me half a year to untangle. Who the evidence was handed to, which office took it, how the case moved after it left my desk. I remembered the case. I hadn't thought about the names associated with it in years. My notes showed the file had been sent to a young assistant district attorney responsible for case intake, T. Braddock. For months, I'd been funneling evidence into that office through reports and findings, but I'd never sat across a desk from the man reading them. That was just the rule back then. I did the digging, and someone else stood in court using what I'd found. I remembered that the prosecutors who occasionally spoke to me mentioned that this young ADA asked very sharp, specific follow-up questions. Those questions told me he understood exactly what he was looking at. He wasn't just going through the motions. I kept searching, fueled by a curiosity that had nothing to do with my own case and everything to do with old habits. A digitized newspaper clipping popped up. A grainy piece of local news footage taken on the courthouse steps a year after that case closed. A young man in an ill-fitting suit, maybe 30-something, talking into a reporter's microphone about a conviction his office had just secured. He was confident, measured, choosing his words like someone who already understood the weight those words would one day carry. I paused the video and studied his face. Younger, thinner, but the bone structure and that determined look in his eyes were unmistakable. Over the years, I'd caught glimpses of him in old news photos. Trevor Braddock, the prosecutor whose early conviction record was largely built on evidence I'd gathered and handed over, even though I'd never once shaken his hand. Now he was a judge. Now he was the man who would decide if my son's lawsuit held any water. I leaned back in my chair, the fluorescent light of the laptop illuminating the dark room. I felt something stirring in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel since Sherman's diagnosis. Not certainty, not relief, just a small, cautious spark. A spark of daring to hope that all of this might actually mean something. I didn't trust it yet. Hope always makes a fool of the woman who welcomes it too early. I slowly closed the laptop, the screen's glow fading away, and sat in the dark for a while longer. I didn't tell Mr. Garrison about what I'd found. I didn't tell anyone. One thing I'd learned was that you keep your cards close to your chest until you're sure of what they're worth. When I woke up the next morning, I felt a level of clarity I hadn't experienced since Sherman got sick. That clarity used to mean I had a case to build, and I didn't have the patience to sit around and wait anymore. I made coffee, though I didn't take a sip, and cleared everything off the dining room table except for a legal pad and my reading glasses. It felt just like it did back when I was starting a long, arduous job that no one would thank me for until it was done. The company I'd founded was registered under my maiden name, Priscilla Delqua, long before I was ever called Mrs. Winfield. Even though my family only called it Priscilla's work, it had always been mine. Not in an emotional sense, but in a legal one. It was registered and built in my own name years before I ever put on a wedding ring. Back then, I was a young woman who started from scratch, driven by stubbornness and a knack for digging up the truths others tried to cover up. A few years into the marriage, I'd updated the registration to my married name for administrative reasons. That was all. Ownership never changed hands. I took the key to the old filing cabinet from the deepest drawer of my vanity. Sherman used to joke about it, calling it my treasure chest key, as if I were hiding gold instead of documents. But in a way, I supposed he was right. I had boxes in a storage unit 2 towns over that I hadn't opened in years. Articles of incorporation, tax records, ownership papers. The specific dates stamped on those documents now filled me with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. I spent most of the day there, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in dust, pulling folder after folder and spreading them out on a folding table. Just like I used to do when I was organizing evidence to put someone in prison. The original documents establishing my sole ownership were signed 6 years before I'd even met Sherman. Before the love, before the marriage, before the birth of a little boy who would grow up believing his father built everything around him. I flattened the document and stared at it for a long time, feeling a sense of stability in my heart that I hadn't felt since the funeral. It wasn't comfort exactly, but something steadier. Certainty. I spent the whole night cross-referencing 30 years of renewals, amendments, and minor administrative filings, ensuring the paper trail from start to finish told a consistent story. It was hers and only hers, long before there was ever anything theirs to argue about. When I got home, I was exhausted, but it was the kind of exhaustion that felt full, not empty. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Solid ground beneath my feet. That feeling lasted until just past 9 that night when my phone rang. "Mrs. Winfield, this is Garrison," he said. His voice had lost its usual gentle, unhurried calm. "I need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning." The opposing counsel just filed new documentation before the trial. What new documentation? I paused. In that pause, I felt the solid ground I'd spent all day rebuilding sway slightly beneath me. An application for a joint bank account from years ago. It has Sherman's signature on it, and the wording suggests he had joint ownership of at least one account under the company's name. He hesitated again. "I have to ask you directly. Were you aware of this?" I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the very table where I'd spent a full day laying out evidence proving that everything had been mine all along. "No," I said. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I was being entirely literal. "I have no idea what he's talking about." I didn't sleep a wink that night. Not a single minute. There was a tiny, persistent voice in the back of my mind asking a question I couldn't answer. What if I was wrong about the one thing I'd built my entire life around? Garrison had emailed me a copy of the document before I'd even gotten home from his office. I sat under the kitchen light, reading it over and over, as if the sheer repetition could change what was written on the page. It was real. A joint signature card, signed 11 years ago. tied to an operating account under my company's name. Sherman's signature sat right next to mine, clean, clear, right in the spot for a joint signer. For a stretch of time I'd rather not admit to, I let myself spiral into a full-blown panic. I sat there, mentally rehearsing every scenario this could mean. How the opposing counsel would twist a single, isolated signature into a narrative. A woman who'd always shared control, only to change her mind when it suited her. I thought of Chantel's face in the courthouse hallway, that sharp, polite smile. At 1 in the morning in my kitchen, I knew exactly how triumphant she'd feel when she showed that document to a jury. I forced myself to stand up. Panic had never solved a single problem in my life, and I wasn't about to make an exception tonight. I went back to those boxes from the storage unit, the same ones that had covered my dining table the day before, and started over. This time, I moved slower, not looking for what I already believed I'd find, but reading every single page. It was nearly 4 in the morning, my eyes stinging and my coffee ice cold, when I finally found it. It was a folder I'd almost missed, marked years ago in my own handwriting. Operating account. Authorized signatories. That joint signature card wasn't a transfer of ownership at all. It was a routine banking procedure I'd authorized that year, adding Sherman as an authorized signer on that specific operating account so he could handle daily deposits while I was away on cases, which often took me away for weeks at a time. Banks require that kind of paperwork for anyone granted deposit authority, regardless of ownership. It was an arrangement of convenience, nothing more. It never touched the ownership documents. It never touched control of the company itself. Any bank manager would recognize it as routine at a glance, but stripped of context and placed before 12 strangers in a jury box, it looked exactly like what Chantel wanted it to look like. I leaned back as the sky outside began to turn gray. The relief washed over me in slow, ragged waves, like blood returning to a numb limb. I had the truth, I was certain now, but I also realized something else. Knowing the truth while sitting in the quiet morning light, a different skill set entirely than making 12 strangers believe it, under pressure. And I wasn't sure Garrison had that second skill. I thought of the courthouse hallway, Chantel's certainty, and the way she'd left with her hand on Jared's arm. I couldn't fight this battle with a man who only knew how to handle property disputes for church friends. Not anymore. As the first light of dawn hit the kitchen, I picked up my phone. I searched for a name a colleague had urged on me years ago, someone who, he'd sworn, could dismantle any case in the world. Bernice Holloway's office wasn't luxurious, but everything in it felt weighted, substantial. So did she. She didn't stand up when I walked in, nor did she offer the polite, pitying smile most lawyers give a new client walking in with fear and desperation. She just looked up from the folder already open on her desk, my folder which I'd sent 2 days earlier, and stared at me for a long time before she spoke. "Sit down, Mrs. Winfield." I sat. "I looked at what you sent," she said, tapping the folder with 2 fingers. "That joint account card. Explain to me why this looks, on its face, exactly like what your son's lawyer is trying to prove." "It was a tax restructuring," I said, "adding a secondary signer to an operating account so my husband could handle deposits while I was traveling." That's what you told me in the email, she interrupted. Not unkindly, but certainly not gently. I'm asking what hard evidence you have, beyond your word. I felt a spark of grit I hadn't felt in a long time. That specific sting of being questioned by someone I needed on my side. I have the original registration documents, I said, keeping my voice steady. I have the tax filings from that year. I have the correspondence with my accountant from that time explaining the restructuring, dated that very same month. Show me. I pulled the files from my bag and laid them out across her desk, page by page. Just as I used to do for prosecutors who needed proof to move a case forward. The original ownership registration from 6 years before I'd even met Sherman. The tax restructuring memos. The letter signed and dated by my accountant, clearly explaining why a second signature was added to that one account, limited strictly to deposit authority. Holloway looked at them slowly. She wasn't in a hurry. She occasionally circled back to compare dates, like she was hunting for a crack I might have missed. This document, she finally said, pointing to the original ownership paper, predates your marriage by 6 years. Yes. And this joint account card was signed 11 years after that. Yes. She leaned back, no longer studying the papers but me. You built a real business on your own before any of this. Yes. For the first time since I'd walked in. Her posture shifted. The guarded skepticism relaxed, replaced by something close to respect. Most people who walk through that door claiming they're innocent are lying, she said. But you're not. No, I said. I'm not. She closed the folder, tapped the edge against the table to align it, and looked at me with a new, sharper, and more curious gaze. Tell me about your work, she said. I'm talking about the real work behind the company name on the paperwork, I told her. Not everything. Some things I wasn't ready to tell a stranger, even one I was starting to trust. But enough. Fraud investigations, decades of experience, the cases where my name never made the headlines, because that's how the job worked. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, she leaned forward, studying me the same way I used to study files that were finally starting to make sense. In that courtroom, she asked, does anyone actually understand the work you did back then? I answered Holloway's question 3 days before we stepped back into that courtroom. A few names surfaced, slower than I'd expected. People I hadn't spoken to in years, a former colleague I used to trade files with, a prosecutor I'd teamed up with to send a man who'd stolen an entire retirement community's pension to federal prison. Holloway made a few calls. I didn't ask her what she said to them. I didn't realize what she'd said until I walked back into that courtroom. For a civil property dispute like mine, the gallery was more crowded than I'd expected. I recognized one face in the back. Odell Marsh, a white-collar defense attorney I hadn't seen since we worked a case together nearly 15 years ago. He gave me a slight nod, unsure if I'd remember him. I did. 2 rows up sat a woman I didn't recognize, holding a standard stenographer's pad. The posture was undeniable. That was a person there to report a story, not someone living it. Holloway had mentioned offhandedly that a local legal blog covering civil disputes had noticed the docket. A woman accused of exploiting a dying husband, who'd once been a quiet legend in anti-fraud circles. The irony was exactly the kind of drama that earned clicks on a Tuesday morning. It was just a person in a seat, but it was enough. As we sat at the defense table, Holloway leaned in. If the evidence is fundamentally gutted in front of him, the judge has the authority to end this case early, she whispered. It's rare in civil litigation, but there is precedent. I nodded, though my gaze was already drifting toward the bench. It was empty, waiting. Jared sat across the aisle, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward, exactly as he had at the last hearing. Chantal sat beside him, back straight, poised. A woman absolutely confident in a story she'd spent weeks weaving. The bailiff announced the proceedings, and Judge Trevor Braddock walked in. He looked exactly like the man in the old news footage. Time had marked his face in a serious way, making him look even more steady, more inscrutable. A man who'd learned long ago never to let a courtroom see what he was thinking. His professional, unruffled eyes swept the room and landed briefly on the case file. Winfield v. Winfield, he read aloud, his voice flat, filled with procedural indifference. To him, it was just another name on the docket. For now. I felt a tightness in my chest as he looked right past me, not a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. But I reminded myself of what I'd known for days. This is what I expected. He'd never seen my face, only the case notes I'd filed years ago, notes that had passed through countless hands before reaching him. Desmond Aldridge stood first, buttoning his jacket with the practiced ease of a man who thought he already owned the room. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice steady. This case is about a woman who spent a lifetime becoming very, very good at hiding things. A small ripple of movement went through the gallery behind me. I didn't look back. Priscilla Winfield built a career on finding the secrets others tried to bury, Aldridge continued, letting every word land slowly and deliberately. And we intend to prove that when it came to her own husband's failing health, she used every one of those skills. Not to protect him, but to build a life on a foundation of deception right under her family's nose. I sat straight, hands folded, back upright, letting the words wash over me without giving him the reaction he was looking for. Aldridge let his opening statement hang in the air for a long time before continuing. Like a lawyer trying to let the jury marinate in the venom of the accusation before touching any other evidence. My client's father, he continued, suffered from severe cognitive decline in his final years. He was completely cut off from financial transparency, and the person controlling every account, every document, every decision was the only one who held the keys. He turned to the jury, his voice firm, clearly well rehearsed. The evidence will show a bank card with Sherman Winfield's own signature, proving he had a legal claim to assets his wife now insists belong entirely to her. He didn't hold up the document. He just described it as opening statement rules dictate. An opening is a promise of what testimony will show, not the evidence itself before a witness has spoken. A man doesn't sign his name to documents that have nothing to do with him, Aldridge said, unless he was pressured into it. I kept my hands folded, my back straight, my face set in the calm, solemn expression I'd worn since the first day I'd stepped into this court. It cost me more energy than anyone in the room could see, but I'd spent a lifetime learning it. The moment you let your face react to an accusation, you've lost something you can never get back. Across the aisle, I heard a sound before I saw the movement. It was a short, low laugh from Jared, barely a scoff, but unmistakable. He leaned toward Chantel, murmuring something I couldn't catch. She responded with a slight shake of her head, directed right at me. The same mean, dismissive gesture she'd given me in the hall weeks ago. They thought my silence was guilt. I watched them, as if viewing a stranger about to make a terrible mistake from a distance, unable to stop them. My son thought my composure was the act of a woman caught in the act, not a woman who'd spent decades studying exactly how much a facial expression reveals if you let your emotions slip. I looked at him, once, but he didn't meet my eyes. He looked at Aldridge instead, jaw tight, full of conviction. Beside me, Holloway sat perfectly still, her expression giving nothing away. Her legal pad was full of notes I couldn't read. The defense wants you to believe, Aldridge turned to the jury, that ownership never shifted, that everything conveniently and entirely belonged to her. I ask you to keep an open mind and think about why a dying man's name would appear on legal documents related to assets he wasn't supposed to touch. He folded his hands. That concludes my opening statement, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Jared Winfield to the stand. Watching my son stand up and walk to the witness stand. Shoulders back, eyes refusing to find mine. I felt a pang in my chest. Holloway leaned in, her voice low enough only I could hear. This is the start, she said. Let them build this house. When it's our turn, we'll dismantle it, brick by brick. I nodded once, gripping my hands tighter in my lap, and watched my son raise his right hand to swear an oath against me. Jared sat stiffly on the stand, answering Aldridge's gentle questions about his father's final years. His voice was steady, practiced, until Aldridge finally turned to the joint signature card and asked him to describe what it meant to him. It means my father had a stake in the company, Jared said. No matter what she says now, my father was never excluded the way she tried to cover up. Aldridge nodded, satisfied, and finished his direct examination. Holloway stood slowly, unhurried, holding 3 documents instead of 1. Mr. Winfield, she began. You testified that this signature card proves your father had a stake in the company. Do you know when this company was originally formed? Jared hesitated. Not really. I don't know. Holloway submitted the first document as evidence. This document establishes sole ownership under the name Priscilla Delqua, 6 years before your mother married your father. Did you know your mother ever used that name? No. His voice was smaller now. This second document, Holloway continued, is an administrative amendment. A few years into the marriage, it updated the same registration to her married name, Winfield. Ownership itself never changed, only the name on the record did. Were you aware of this document's existence? No. And this third document, she said, holding up the letter I'd found at 4 in the morning weeks ago, is a written explanation from your family accountant. Dated the same month as the signature card. It clearly states this was a routine procedure to add a secondary signer to a specific operating account for deposit purposes only. Were you aware of this letter? No, it was barely a whisper. So, You testified that this signature card proves your father had a stake in the company. Yet you knew nothing about the company existing under a different name before your parents married. Nothing about the name change amendment, and nothing about the letter explaining the actual purpose of the signature card. Is that fair to say? Jared's jaw tightened. He glanced at Chantel, who was sitting rigid, whispering frantically to Aldridge, while Aldridge stared straight ahead, motionless. I didn't know about any of that, Jared finally admitted. Holloway let the silence hang for a moment before turning to the bench. No further questions, Your Honor. Aldridge stood briefly, attempting a redirect regarding isolation and control, but got a stammering, non-responsive answer and sat back down. Moments later, he announced the plaintiff rested its case. The defense calls Priscilla Winfield, Holloway said. I stood and walked to the witness stand, feeling steadier than I had any right to be. 30 years of professional instinct were settling into my spine like an old coat I'd forgotten I could still wear. After being sworn in, Holloway asked me to identify the same 3 documents. I gave the same clean, accurate answers I'd rehearsed in her office. The pre-marriage registration, the later amendment, the restructuring explanation letter. The truth, in plain daylight, arranged clearly in chronological order. Mrs. Winfield, Holloway said, opposing counsel described you as a woman who spent a lifetime becoming very good at hiding things. I want to ask you directly, before your company had a name on any document, what was your profession? The entire courtroom fell into a silence I recognized all too well from a lifetime of court proceedings. I was a fraud investigator, I said. For over 20 years. The silence deepened, the attention in the room sharpening. In your work, Holloway continued, did you have the opportunity to build case files that were subsequently prosecuted by this county's district attorney's office? Yes, many times. Holloway paused, letting that sink in, then asked the question I hadn't expected her to ask so bluntly. Mrs. Winfield, is it possible that someone in this courtroom once relied on your work without ever having met you? I answered Holloway's question the only way I knew how. Flat, unhurried. When you finally stop hiding the truth, let the truth do what it does best. It's possible, I said. I spent years writing reports submitted to the district attorney's office. Insurance fraud, embezzlement, cases of exploitation against the elderly. My name rarely appeared in public. The prosecutors who used my work were the ones whose names made the papers, not me. One of those cases, Holloway said, involved an insurance fraud ring you investigated over 20 years ago. Is that right? Yes. Can you tell the jury who was responsible for the intake of that case at the time? Even before I said the name, I felt an overwhelming silence descend on the room. It had nothing to do with the jury. It was entirely about the man sitting above us all in the black robe. He was halfway turned to look at his notes, completely unaware that something was about to hit him. A young assistant district attorney, Ada, who was in charge of case intake at the time, I said. Trevor Braddock. There wasn't a gasp of shock. It was quieter than that. It was the dead silence of 100 people realizing the same thing at once, but not yet knowing how to handle it. I looked at him. I forced myself to look at him, because I'd waited weeks to see this happen, and I wasn't about to miss it. Judge Braddock's pen stopped mid-sentence. His eyes, slowly lifted from the files in front of him, looking first at Holloway, then at me. I watched 20 years of distance collapse in the space of a single breath. His hands on the bench began to tremble slightly, a small tremor, but enough to make the court reporter look up at him hesitantly. Winfield, he began. At first, his voice was so small, I almost thought it was a hallucination. Then it grew louder, filled with disbelief. It was a whisper, but clear, because the courtroom had gone completely silent. My God, it really is her. No one moved. Every face in the gallery turned. Odell Marsh in the back, the reporter whose pen had stopped mid-sentence. Jared half rose from his seat, as if he didn't even realize he'd moved. Braddock cleared his throat. Once, twice, visibly pulling himself back into the role of judge. The entire courtroom still needed him to maintain order. Let the record show, he said, his voice steadier now, but not quite calm. This court has just learned that the witness's prior professional work intersects with a case I handled early in my career as a prosecutor. Although we have never met privately. To ensure absolute transparency, I ask both counsel to comment on whether the historical connection requires me to recuse myself from these proceedings. Aldridge was the first to stand, clearly caught off guard. After a brief, whispered consultation with Chantel, he stated that given the evidence had already been sufficiently presented, he saw no reason to request a recusal. Holloway agreed, noting that the connection was historical and indirect, with no substantive impact on the written evidence already presented to the court. Braddock nodded slowly, noting the positions for the record. Then I will remain on the bench, he said, and will rule based solely on the evidence presented. Nothing more. Across the courtroom, I caught his eye. Since I'd buried my husband, since a stranger had handed me a subpoena in my own driveway, since my son had called me by my first name, as if I were a woman he'd never met. For the first time ever, in this room, someone finally knew who I was. Not the neglectful mother who vanished into quiet rooms for no reason, but the investigator who worked in the shadows, never getting the credit, but whose work had shaped the career of the man now sitting here judging her. Recess for 15 minutes, he said, standing from the bench. Then I will render my decision. Those 15 minutes felt longer than the previous 3 weeks. Holloway sat beside me at the defense table, quiet, as inscrutable as she'd been throughout the trial. But I noticed her hands were clasped tighter than before. I rested my hands quietly in my lap, waiting as I had waited for 100 verdicts that had nothing to do with me. Back then, waiting was just part of the job, not my entire life. The bailiff announced that proceedings had resumed. Judge Braddock walked in, calm, the tremor in his hands gone, though some expression on his face hadn't quite reset. For the record, he began. This court has addressed the historical connection between the witness and this judge during the recess, and both parties have confirmed they have no objection to my continued presiding. The ruling stands. He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. We will proceed based solely on the evidence. Before he could speak further to the jury, Holloway stood up. Your Honor, at this time, The defense moves for a judgment as a matter of law. The evidence presented has uncontrovertibly established that ownership of the assets predates the marriage by years, and the joint signature card in question conveyed no transfer of control. Based on this record, no rational jury could reach any other conclusion. Braddock nodded slowly, taking one final glance at the documents in front of him before speaking. In light of the evidence presented to this court, I find that no rational jury could reach the conclusion that the defendant exerted undue influence over her husband's assets. When the record clearly shows these assets predated the marriage itself by years, and in some cases, decades. He looked up, first at the jury, then briefly at me. This court grants the motion for judgment as a matter of law in favor of the defendant. This case is dismissed. This court further orders the record to show the allegations presented by the plaintiff lacked substantive evidentiary support from the start. I didn't move immediately. I let the words sink in, the way you let boiling water cool until you're sure it won't burn you. Beside me, Aldridge sat ramrod straight, jaw tight, already beginning to pack his files with the stiff efficiency of a man who knew there was no room left for argument. Across the aisle, Jared was frozen in his seat, staring at the empty spot where the judge had just been, as if the ruling hadn't yet traveled from his ears to the part of him that still needed to process it all. I slowly gathered my own folder, gave Holloway a nod, and stood from my seat, saying nothing to anyone at the plaintiff's table. I walked into the hallway alone. Holloway trailed a step behind, speaking quietly about next steps that I only half listened to. Right there, near the tall windows at the end of the hall, I heard Chantel's sharp voice behind me. This is not the life I wanted. A dismissed case and legal fees we can't afford. From the moment this nightmare started costing us money instead of bringing it in, I told you it was a mistake. I turned slightly, just in time to see her standing a few feet from Jared. Her coat was already draped over one arm, her eyes cold and full of a disappointment that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a lost payday. She didn't wait for him to answer. She walked straight past him, the sharp click of her heels on the expensive marble floor, echoing as she walked through the courthouse doors without looking back once. Jared stood alone in the center of the hall, his shoulders slumped. Compared to the man who'd sat across the aisle stone-faced for 3 weeks of hearings, he suddenly looked so very small. Holloway gently touched my arm. I'll go pull the car around, she said, heading toward the exit. I turned the other way toward the quiet end of the hall. I hadn't taken more than a few steps before I heard footsteps behind me. Hesitant, stumbling unmistakably his. I stopped but didn't turn around right away. I gave him the same courtesy he had never offered me. Let him decide if he actually had something to say or if he just needed me to hear him following. Mom. Not Priscilla. It was the first time he'd called me that since this nightmare began. I turned slowly. He stood a few feet away, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The rigid conviction that had sustained him as he sat across from me for 3 weeks, stone-faced, had vanished, leaving him looking hollowed out. I don't even know where to start, he said. Since we've finally reached a place where the truth is allowed, you can start with the truth, I replied. He winced, but he didn't look away. I heard it in there. Fraud investigator, 20 years. The files the DA's office used. He shook his head slowly, as if the words still felt foreign in his mouth. How did I not know this? Because I never told you, I said. And you never asked. If I had asked, would you have told me? I considered the question carefully, because he needed honesty more than comfort right now. I don't know. Maybe I spent your whole childhood deciding what was more important, being present in your life or being known by you. I chose to be present. I don't regret that. But I do regret letting you grow up believing that quiet meant empty. He was silent for a long time, looking down at the marble floor between us, as if the tiles held words easier to say than the heavy facts pressing on his chest. Chantel said you were hiding something, he finally said. I believed her because believing her was easier than admitting. I had never wondered what my own mother did with her days before I was born. I know, I said. I watched you believe her. Even then, I understood why. But that didn't make it right. It didn't, he said. It really didn't. He looked up at me, his eyes glassy, struggling for composure. He was in his 30s, but in that moment, he looked exactly like the little boy who used to ask me what his father did for a living, never once turning that question toward me. I'm sorry, he said. I don't know if that means anything at this point. It means something, I said. But it doesn't erase the fact that you sat across from me for 3 weeks, treating me like a stranger you needed to defend yourself against. Making up for that is going to take much longer than an apology in a courthouse hallway. He nodded, accepting it. He no longer had the strength to argue. A look that finally seemed like his own, not a rehearsed script, settled on his face for the first time in weeks. Can I call you? He asked. Not about the case, about other things. All of it. You can call, I said. But I can't promise what you'll get when you do. I'm still the same woman I was before all of this happened, only I'm not planning on hiding her anymore. He nodded again. I didn't hug him. Some distances cannot be closed in a hallway, no matter how much two people might want it. I just gave him a single nod, turned, and walked toward the car door where Holloway was waiting, leaving him standing there to carry the weight he had to process on his own. He'd asked me who I really was. I told him the truth. The front door clicked shut behind me, the deadbolt sliding home with a heavy final sound. And then, I heard it. It was a sound no home should ever contain. A child sobbing in such desperation, it felt like something inside him had been ripped in two. I dropped my designer handbag and luggage on the Persian rug in the foyer. My flight from London Heathrow to JFK had landed 4 hours early. I hadn't told anyone I was coming back to my home in Greenwich, Connecticut tonight. I had intended to surprise them. But now, I stood frozen in the beautifully decorated entrance, listening to crying that felt entirely alien to this quiet, comfortable, almost arrogant mansion. My name is Cassandra Payton. I've been a wife for 4 years, and for the last 4, I've held another role. The only mother a 15-year-old boy named Marquez has truly known since he was 9. I followed the sound and found him on the bottom step of the back staircase leading to the kitchen. He was curled into a ball, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, cheeks soaked, eyes red and swollen. He'd been crying for a long time. Through the French kitchen windows, I could see the golden outdoor string lights in the backyard, casting shadows over the meticulously manicured boxwood hedges. Bursts of laughter drifted across the lawn. My husband, Isaiah, was holding a glass of bourbon, effortlessly entertaining 3 men I didn't know. He threw his head back and laughed, as if the world owed him a perfect night and was paying it back in full. Marquez? I knelt on the hardwood floor. Honey, what happened? At the sound of my voice, he jolted and looked up, his eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe I was real. You're back early, he whispered. I wanted to surprise you all. I reached out and gently brushed his sweat-dampened curls from his forehead. Does your father know you're sitting here crying like this? He nodded slowly. He told me to go wash my face. He didn't want his friends to see me like this. Something inside my chest went deathly still and cold. I stood up, walked to the back door, and pushed it open just enough for my voice to carry. Isaiah. He turned, charming and polished, even raising his glass toward me as if I were part of the evening's entertainment. Cass! You're back early, honey. Come over here and meet. Marquez is having a very hard time, I said, my expression unchanging. His perfect smile didn't even flicker. He's fine. Teenage boy stuff. He's crying over nothing. He looked back at his guests, and one of the men chuckled in agreement, as if that casual dismissal of a child's pain was the final word. I closed the door. If you're listening to me right now, ask yourself, when you discover that the home you love is just an empty shell, does time still hold meaning? Because in that moment, where I stood, the passage of time lost all significance. I walked back to Marquez. He was still shaking. Tell me the truth, I said, looking him in the eyes. All of it. Don't leave anything out. At first he wouldn't look at me. But when he finally lifted his gaze, the words he spoke restructured something permanently within me. Last week, I heard him on the phone in his study. Marquez's voice was low, laced with suppressed terror. He was whispering, he said. Once everything's finalized. Cass, the way he sounded, it was exactly like the way he sounded on the phone right before my biological mother passed away. The room seemed to tilt. Marquez, I'm so scared for you. His voice shattered, tears flowing again. I feel like what happened to my mom is going to happen to you. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just stood there, staring at this boy. For the days I'd spent flying across the North Atlantic, he'd been carrying this bone-chilling terror alone, while I had no idea that my own life might be on a countdown. Behind me, through the window, Isaiah laughed again, loud, easy, unscathed. That night, I didn't go back into the backyard. I didn't confront him. When he walked into the bedroom later, smelling of expensive cologne and bourbon, I smiled to greet him. I kissed his cheek, acting as if there wasn't a single thing wrong inside my chest. But something inside me had shifted. From that night on, I would watch my husband in a new way, the way you watch a man you no longer trust. Quietly, cautiously, and never letting him catch my gaze. The next morning, I didn't knock on Marquez's door until Isaiah had driven off in his Range Rover for his early meeting. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in yesterday's clothes, guarded as if he couldn't even trust sleep. When he saw it was me, his tensed shoulders relaxed by an inch. Can we talk? I asked. A real talk. No half measures. He nodded. For several long seconds, he just stared at his hands. Then, he began to speak, slowly, as if every word cost him a piece of his life force. In the time before my mom died, the mood in the house changed. It was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. He picked at a loose thread on his cuff. She used to sing in the kitchen, and then one day, she just stopped. No one said why. Did she look afraid? I asked softly. Not the kind of afraid where you cry. It was careful afraid. Like she was constantly checking what she said around Isaiah. He looked up at me with a heartbreaking maturity. The more afraid she was, the calmer he got. The more nervous she was, the happier he seemed. It was like her fear made him relax. I felt a cold chill settle deep in my stomach. Marquez, that is too much for a 9-year-old. No one asked me anything back then. I was only 9. His voice turned hoarse. Grown-ups talked around me like I didn't exist. You're the first person who ever actually asked me what I saw. I reached out and gripped his hand. I'm asking you now. He gripped back, a strength in his hand that didn't belong to a 15-year-old boy trying to pretend he didn't need anyone. A week before she died, he brought people to the house. Men I never saw again. Suits, briefcases. He was always on the phone, voice low, doors closed. Marquez swallowed hard. I heard him say, "This has to be handled quietly and all at once." I didn't know what it meant then. But I do now, because last week I heard him talking about you the exact same way. The heavy sound of a car door closing drifted up from below, and we both went rigid. Is it him? I whispered. Marquez listened intently, then shook his head slowly. No, it must be Mr. Kessler, the mailman, coming early. His shoulders dropped a fraction, but only a fraction. He has an investment meeting today. He usually doesn't come home until the afternoon. Still, the sound had done its work. Marquez's voice dropped lower, his speed increased, as if he desperately needed to get it all out before the house filled with other people's energy. I'm not making this up, he said. I just know what that quiet feels like before things go wrong. And this house, it's gotten just as quiet as it was then. I sat in that heavy silence for a while, feeling the truth pressing in on me like the air before a storm. He hadn't given me hard evidence. He had given me an intuition built on real memories, real fear, and the genuine love of a mother lost too soon. And now, that love had shifted to me. Thank you for trusting me, I said firmly. He nodded, wiping his face. For the first time all week, he looked like a boy who had finally set down a massive weight and wasn't fighting the battle alone anymore. I left his room, my chest tight, my mind racing. I told myself I was just patrolling the house, making sure everything was in order before Isaiah came home. That was why I was standing at the door to his study, telling myself, as his wife, I had every right to be here, and then I saw it. A manila folder, resting carelessly on the edge of his massive mahogany desk, half hidden by a stack of business documents. On the Folders tab, written in his strong, bold handwriting, was my name. Cassandra Payton. I had never asked him to handle any business for me that required its own folder. For the next 2 days, Isaiah said nothing about those papers. He slipped back into his perfect rhythm, acting as if the crying in the hallway had never happened. I didn't touch the folder. Just as my hand was about to reach for it, I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway, and I backed away from the desk so abruptly I nearly knocked over the brass lamp. When Isaiah walked into the study, I was standing by the window, pretending I'd just wandered in to look at the view. "There you are," he smiled, loosening the tie of his custom shirt out of habit. "Perfect. Saves me from having to go look for you later." He walked straight past me to the desk and picked up the exact folder I'd been staring at minutes before. "Just some family housekeeping," he said, opening the folder and pulling out a small stack of papers. "Annual update for the estate trust, renewal for the home and auto insurance, and a healthcare authorization." "You know how these damn HIPAA privacy laws in the US are. If you sign this, if you ever travel or end up in the hospital, I can handle the pharmacy and doctor bills for you directly. Boring adult paperwork. I just need your signature on a few of these." My throat went dry. "What exactly am I signing?" "Nothing dramatic." He laughed, an easy, warm sound. He pushed the papers across the desk toward me. "Updated beneficiary forms, policy renewals, a few authorizations so I don't have to hunt you down every time something needs a signature. You know how insurance companies are. Everything has to be signed twice." I looked down at the pages. Dense paragraphs printed in tiny font, filled with legalese like "authorized representative" and "subsequent modifications." The design was meant to encourage skimming, not reading. "Can I look these over tonight and sign them tomorrow?" Something flickered in his eyes. It was incredibly brief, perfectly controlled, and gone as quickly as it had appeared. "Honey, it's just routine paperwork. I have a big conference call with Wall Street in 10 minutes." He picked up his Mont Blanc pen and tapped it gently on the desk. "Unless you don't trust me with even something this small." The question landed exactly where he intended. It wasn't pressure. It was an accusation wrapped in the guise of patience. For a middle-class American wife trying to maintain the perfect marriage, it was lethal. "Of course I trust you," I said. I hated how smoothly the words slipped out of my mouth. I signed where he pointed. 4 signatures, maybe 5. My hand moved faster than my intellect. When I put the pen down, I couldn't have told you what was on a single page. He kissed my forehead, as if declaring the business finished. "That's all there is to it." That night, lying beside him, I replayed the moment from the afternoon in slow motion in my head, over and over again. Authorized representative. Subsequent modification. The words could mean nothing. The words could mean everything. The next morning, once he'd left for the office, I called his firm and requested a copy of the documents I'd signed. Just for my own files, I told his administrative assistant, keeping my tone light and unhurried. Less than an hour later, Isaiah called me back personally. His voice sounded pleasant on the surface, but underneath, it was pulled tight. "Cass, you didn't have to call the office. You could have just asked me." "I am asking you now," I said. "I'd just like a few copies." Silence. For a request as simple as this, the silence was too long. "They're with my lawyer," he finally said. "I'll have him send them over when he has a moment." "When would that be?" "Soon." Another silence. "Why are you so focused on this right now?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't make him suspicious. So I gave him the only safe reply I had left. "I'm not. I'm just in the habit of keeping my own copies of everything I sign." He let out a short laugh, the kind completely devoid of humor. Noted. The call ended. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at my phone, chewing on his answer like I was petting a stone that had a razor blade hidden inside. With his lawyer, I didn't believe it. Not for a second. 3 days passed, and I heard nothing from Isaiah's lawyer. I stopped waiting. I found the name of our life insurance provider on an old renewal notice in the back of a kitchen drawer. That afternoon, while Isaiah was having lunch with the same group of investors who'd been in the backyard that night, I registered for an online account on the insurance company's website, using my SSN and personal information. As one of the policyholders, I had every right to see what I'd signed. It took less than 10 minutes to find the policy. My hands went ice cold as I read the electronic document. The beneficiary section had been updated, not just refreshed, but completely reorganized. Isaiah remained the primary beneficiary, which I'd expected. But tucked beneath that was a newly added secondary clause, granting him limited power as policy administrator. That meant, from now on, he had the authority to adjust the terms of the policy without needing my signature again. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from stress. I had never agreed to let him be the administrator of anything. My understanding was that I was signing routine renewal paperwork. Then, I saw the date of the amendment. 6 days ago, I was still on my business trip in London. 6 days ago, Marquez had already been lying awake, listening to his stepfather's hushed voice behind a closed door. Those words had terrified him so much that for the days before I returned home, he'd been hiding in the corner crying alone. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated procedure. That evening, Isaiah came home in a fantastic mood. He loosened his tie, hummed an unknown tune, and poured himself a drink. The investors are just about ready to sign, he said, collapsing into the leather armchair across from me. Give it a few more weeks, and this big deal is done. That's wonderful, I said, struggling to keep my tone light, my hands folded in my lap so he wouldn't see them shaking. He stared at me for a full second, a pause that stretched beyond what felt normal. You've been very quiet the last few days. Just tired? Maybe the jet lag hasn't worn off? He took a slow sip of his drink. You didn't go anywhere else while I was gone today, did you? The question was too specific. It wasn't, how was your day? Or, what did you do? It was an interrogation targeted at my location and my movements. As if he had started to suspect I'd been somewhere I shouldn't have been. I stayed home, I said. Why? Nothing. He smiled, but the smile stopped at the corners of his mouth and didn't reach the rest of his face. Just making conversation, I smiled back, matching his gaze with a calm as deep as my own. Deep inside, something snapped into place. A switch I hadn't realized existed clicked on. He wasn't just maintaining his perfect image anymore. He was scrutinizing me, the way you look at prey you no longer fully trust. This meant I had to be smarter than I was 3 days ago. The naive woman who had signed documents, pushed her way without a second glance, was dead. Late that night, after he'd fallen into a deep sleep beside me, I lay in the dark with my eyes open, replaying the date in my head over and over. 6 days ago. The same week Marquez first heard him on the phone. The same week, the quiet in this house stopped feeling like peace and started feeling like the dead silence before something breaks. I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not in this house, and not with this man. Whatever Isaiah was planning, it hadn't started when I went on my trip. The countdown had begun the moment he decided that I was worth more as a dead woman on paper than as a wife standing right in front of him. The sense of crisis made me hypervigilant about the mail. 3 days later, a bank statement arrived at the house addressed to both of us. It was the only reason I was able to open it before Isaiah came home. It was a loan, a $42,000 home equity line of credit, HELOC, secured by the house, co-signed by Cassandra Payton. It wasn't handled by our usual banks, Chase or Bank of America, but by a small private lender I didn't recognize. The name on the letterhead felt familiar until I remembered a business card I'd seen on the kitchen counter weeks ago. It was one of the men who'd been drinking in the garden that night. A private lender. Isaiah had been courting him with personal favors. In the circles of the wealthy, in the U.S., it was a transaction of interests built on acquaintance trust rather than strict compliance procedures. My signature was printed clearly at the bottom of the disclosure page. At first glance, the flowing cursive looked familiar. But when I leaned in to study it, my stomach dropped. The arc of the capital C was wrong. My wrist would never draw the tail of the C that tightly. Ever since I was a little girl practicing cursive on a different kitchen table, I'd never written it that way. More chillingly, there was no notary seal on the entire page. I remembered clearly when we'd refinanced the house years ago. We'd had to swear oaths and sign in front of a notary. There were no witnesses, no verification call records. Nothing, only a hasty approval between two men who called each other by their first names. I hadn't signed that document. And the person who forged my signature didn't even need to do it in front of anyone, because the lender treated him as a friend and was willing to bypass every security check for him. I sat at the kitchen counter for a long time, staring at my name that didn't belong to me. I felt something break inside my chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to rage. A quiet, highly controlled rage that didn't scream but sharpened itself like a blade. My first thought was simple and violent. Pack. Take Marquez. Run tonight. I even stood up and walked halfway to the hallway closet, but my logic pinned me to the spot. Run with what evidence? A life insurance rider I couldn't fully prove malicious? A signature that only felt wrong to me? This is America. No lawyer, no police officer, and no judge would act on my intuition to go up against a wealthy, high-status man like Isaiah, who was used to manipulating everything with cold precision. Even worse was Marquez. I wasn't his biological mother. Legally, I had no blood relation and no legal custody. If I ran with him tonight, no matter how justified my reasons, it wasn't protection. In the eyes of Connecticut family courts and the police, it was felony kidnapping, custody interference. I had no legal basis to take him anywhere, and Isaiah knew that better than I did. I sat back down on the stool slowly. The fight or flight response didn't vanish. It changed direction. Later that day, Marquez found me sitting at the counter, staring into space. "Are you okay?" he asked, hovering in the doorway, as if he weren't sure he was allowed to come closer. "I'm fine." I quickly shoved the loan statement under a stack of junk mail so he wouldn't see it. Just tired. He didn't move. You've been different since I told you that thing. You're quieter. Like, like you're listening for something. I am listening, I confessed, just not the way you think. Are you going to leave him? That question, coming from a 15-year-old, was more heartbreaking than if any adult had asked it. Not yet, I said, choosing my words carefully. Leaving without proof would only make things worse for both of us. I have to figure out what I'm fighting first. He watched me. There was a maturity in his eyes far beyond his years, like Mom should have done. Like your mom didn't have the time to do, I corrected him, gently but firmly. I have time, and I am absolutely not going to waste it. That night, when the house fell into silence, I sat alone in the dark, opened my MacBook, and typed Isaiah's full name into the search bar. 4 years of marriage, and this was the first time I had ever searched for my husband on the internet. Not out of gossip-hungry curiosity, but out of a desperate, survivalist instinct. I wasn't looking for scandal. I was looking for a pattern. If this had happened before, if there was another version of this story hidden in his past, a marriage that ended in widowhood rather than divorce, I had to find it before he decided to Jidanize things with me. I didn't confront him that night or the next morning. Instead, I started digging into the only part of his life he had never let me fully touch, his past. Isaiah had a habit of working in his study on Saturday mornings. The door was ajar, phone pressed to his ear. I used to think it was just a harmless routine for a high-level American executive. Now, I saw it as a dark window. Saturday. While he was in the study 2 rooms away, whispering financial data into the phone, I sat at the kitchen island and adjusted the angle of my laptop so the screen faced away from the hallway. I typed in a name that had never been spoken aloud in this house. Willa Payton. The first thing that popped up was a 3-paragraph local news brief from 6 years ago. A 34-year-old woman was found dead at the bottom of the basement stairs in the home she shared with her husband. The county medical examiner's office ruled the cause of death an accidental fall. There were no signs of struggle, and police ruled out foul play. I read those few lines twice, my pulse thundering in my ears. No signs of struggle didn't mean there wasn't someone else there. It just meant no one left evidence that could be used for a conviction. I kept digging. A short follow-up reported that police had opened a routine investigation, but closed it within weeks. The reason, insufficient evidence to prove the case, was anything other than a tragic accident. No suspects were named, and there were no further media reports. The story ended simply, like every case where no one pushed for the truth. Next, I searched for Willa's maiden name, Foy. I wanted to find any link between her family and Isaiah's past, or the car accident that took his parents' lives. Nothing. No shared counties, no overlapping names in any public records I could access. There was no indication that her family had any connection to him before their marriage. This meant the reason he was drawn to Willa was fundamentally different from what drove him toward me. The realization felt heavier than I expected. If this wasn't a reenactment of tragedy for a specific old grudge, it meant this was a method, a methodology. He could target this pattern at anyone who suited his interests. From the meager documentation I could find, Willa's family was quite wealthy. Landowners operating a small manufacturing firm. That kind of old money that never flaunted itself. He hadn't married her because of some psychological trauma. He married her because she had utility. A slight creak of floorboards sounded in the hallway, and I slammed the laptop halfway shut, my heart racing. "You're up early." Isaiah appeared at the kitchen doorway, phone finally away from his ear. "Couldn't sleep." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Was thinking about making breakfast." He walked to the coffee machine, close enough that I slightly shifted my body so the screen's dim light wouldn't hit my knees. "Conference call with a big development project in 20 minutes, he said. "Investors want final numbers by next week." "That's fantastic," I said, though I didn't believe a single punctuation mark of it. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, stared at me a second longer than usual, and turned back toward the hallway. I breathed out slowly and opened the computer again, this time searching for something more specific. Willa's life insurance. If there were any public probate court records. It took me longer, but I finally found a tiny detail in the corner of an old court file. A massive insurance claim had been processed within 6 weeks of Willa's death. 6 weeks. Too fast. Faster than most claims, especially for an unnatural death that had once been investigated. I leaned back, staring at the numbers on the screen, feeling an ugly outline coming together before my eyes. An ordinary accident wouldn't result in such a swift payout. Only a flawless application could do that. 2 days later, I used a paid public court database to find the medical examiner's autopsy summary hidden in that brief investigation file. Most of it read exactly like the news brief. Blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. Toxicology clean. No signs of forced entry. An ordinary tragedy, filed, closed. But one line made me freeze. The medical examiner noted that the bruising pattern observed on the victim's forearms was atypical for an unobserved single fall. But the very next sentence dismissed that concern with a shrug. But not inconsistent with the victim attempting to grab the handrail during the fall. Not inconsistent. The phrase left a nauseating bitterness on my tongue. It proved nothing. It was just an explanation chosen by someone who wanted to close the file as quickly as possible rather than ask new questions. The scratch marks of defensive resistance and the bruises from grabbing a handrail were too blurry to tell apart without a witness to contest them. I thought of 9-year-old Marquez sitting in a corner of that house on the night she died. My throat tightened as if I'd swallowed broken glass. I walked away from the computer, forcing myself to calm down for the first time all week. Willa's family had no connection to Isaiah's parents. No old vendetta, no ties to his childhood trauma. Whatever had made him choose, Willa wasn't out of grief. And wasn't because he thought she owed him anything. It was just because she appeared at the right time, and her wealth was comfortable and useful. This should have brought me a shred of security. Proof that I wasn't being pulled into some individual, decades-long paranoid obsession. Instead, it terrified me more. If this wasn't about a specific hatred, it was a tool. A repeatable, patient methodology that could target anyone who fit his needs. This meant I wasn't special to him at all. I was just next. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence for a long time, feeling something inside me go completely cold. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't shake anymore, because it has already made its decision. That evening, searching for other clues buried in public records, I checked an old storage unit that Isaiah was still paying rent on every month. I knew about the detail only because I'd seen public storage on our shared bank account's autopay records, back when I assumed it held nothing more than old furniture. Unexpectedly, I didn't find storage records, but a digitized index for an old wrongful death suit. It had nothing to do with Willa. I didn't recognize the names of the plaintiff or the defendant. But at the bottom of the file, listed as a relevant party in the attached original accident report, were two names that made my stomach tighten into a knot. Raymond Payton and Odette Payton, his parents. I froze, staring at those names. In 4 years of marriage, I had never heard him speak them aloud. He'd only told me once, long ago, in an offhand way, that his parents died in a car accident when he was small. That was it. No shared grief, no photos in the house. And now, here they were in an old case file from decades ago. This was long before Willa, decades before me. Down the hall, I heard the door to his study open. "Cass?" he called out. His voice was steady, but there was a probing quality to it. An interrogator's tone rather than a simple call. "What are you busy with in there?" I shut the laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Nothing," I called back. "Just paying a few bills." An unsettling silence followed. "Right," he finally said. "Let me know if you need help." I sat there, staring at the closed computer, his parents' names still burning on my retinas. I realized I had just touched the absolute origin point of everything. Thursday, Isaiah left home for an out-of-state field trip. For the first time in months, the house was entirely mine. I waited until his car disappeared from the end of the driveway before walking into his study. The locked drawer under his desk had never caught my attention before. I'd always assumed it held old tax documents, the boring papers that build the framework of a marriage. That morning, I'd found the spare key in the kitchen junk drawer. I'd seen him toss it there carelessly. I told myself I was just going to look. Just one look. In the drawer, beneath a stack of business contracts, lay a thin, water-stained folder. It looked older than anything else in the drawer. The edges were softened by time. The ink faded to brown in places. It was a police traffic report from decades ago. I sat down slowly and opened it. The report documented a head-on collision on a bridge during a rainy night. A van had lost control, crossed the median, and struck a smaller car head-on. The two deceased were listed as Raymond Payton and Odette Payton, his parents. Pinned to the report with a rusted paperclip was an insurance investigator's supplement. It was a record of witness statements gathered to handle the trucking company's liability claim. My hands shook uncontrollably as I turned the pages. Most of the contents were programmatic and dry. The cold language of investigators chasing precision rather than human feeling. Then, I turned to a standalone witness statement.